Monday here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. We're going to make it a mailbag Monday, answering a lot of your questions, including questions about how the Steelers are going to handle their number 2 wide receiver possession. It's the Locked On Steelers podcast. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Steelers, your daily Pittsburgh Steelers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, bringing you your daily dose of all things on the Pittsburgh Steelers. As always, you can find this show on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe to this YouTube channel to get all of your daily Monday through Friday episodes, as well as our bonus content. Thank you for making us your first listen every day, because we're your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Make every moment more as playoffs wind down. The sports stops sporting like we want them to, but this summer FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. All right, everyone. So before we get into some of your questions in the mailbag, and we apologize, we haven't gotten them for a bit. Hey, mini camp, OTAs, we're getting lots of content, lots of interviews. We want to prioritize those. But now it's that time of the season where we get to take more of your questions. And we'll get to those in a minute. But first, I want to give some shout outs. First, shout out to my man Nick, who I got to hang out with a bit this weekend. It was great chatting with you, man. Glad that you're a fan of the show and glad that we got to meet in person and have a good talk. Look forward to having more of those in the future. But I have to give my major shout out to my 2 friends and 2 very good friends of the show, guests that you know and love that are on here all the time, both the amazing Mike DeFabo and Jenna Harner. My fiance and I had the distinct honor of attending their wedding this weekend. It was a wonderful weekend, getting to meet their families and everyone there that supports them. It was just a great time to see 2 amazing people get married. It was awesome. We thank you so much for letting us be part of your day. Also, shout out Mike's brother Vince, because in his speech during the reception, he threw a "let's get into it" in the speech, and I was just like, oh my gosh, that was really cool. But again, Mike, Jenna, congratulations. I hope that you have a great honeymoon. So for some of y'all that's going to be out here and they're going to be asking over the next few weeks, where's Mike and where's Jenna? Mind your business. They live in life and stuff. They'll be back on the show eventually when they get time. And to all you simps in the comments section, don't think we don't see you. Jenna's married. Leave it alone. That being said, let's get to the actual parts of the show here. Let's get started with our first mailbag question. This one comes from John out in Georgia. John, take it away.
Chris, John Preston here, down in Cartersville, Georgia. Been a Steelers fan for 51 years. The wide receiver room that everybody's so worried about. I'm wondering if they're not looking at wide receiver 2 as being a combination of multiple people. For example, Denzel Mims, former second-round pick, shown he can play in the NFL. He's got speed and height and size. He'd be great pairing up with Pickens and trying to strike deep, which of course we know is an area of the field that they need to be better at. And then you've got other receivers, all who have skills, including Jefferson, that are more well-rounded. Perhaps by using 2 or 3 of these, their thought is they can create one receiver, in essence, outcome or effort. What are your thoughts on it? And a little bit more in particular, what do you think about Denzel Mims? He was a relatively high draft pick. Thank you. Enjoy the show.
Thank you, John, for your question. And just to give y'all a quick, before y'all jump down John's throat, he asked that question before Denzel Mims got cut. But to be honest, if you asked me if I had answered that question on the air before Denzel Mims got cut, I would have said the same thing. I don't think that he's the guy. I think that the Steelers have invested in young players at wide receiver who they're hoping to step up this year. And I think that that's part of the answer here. So, but to get to the core part, skipping the Denzel Mims part, let's get to the core part of John's question, talking about, can the Steelers find the answer for what would be replacing the production of a wide receiver 2 without investing in, the major trade capital that you need to get a dynamic playmaking wide receiver 2. And do I think it can happen? Yes, because we've seen it be done before. But even before it's done before, I want to talk about how we have gone over on this show the talents and how I think guys like Pat Freiermuth can have a much bigger year and how he can be a vital part of this offense, especially in the middle part of the field with how Arthur Smith plans to use this passing game. By the way, we've also talked about how both the running backs, Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren, can actually be used in the passing game as real threats. But we've also talked about how Calvin Austin has stepped up from Steelers wide receiver coach Zach Azzani, and everyone's speaking highly of him and how he's handled practices so far. He's another guy that could fill in there. We've talked about Darnell Washington and how he can finally get used for certain amounts of production. And then there's still Roman Wilson to figure into this picture, the rookie. How will he turn out? There are lots of options in the Steelers offense. Granted, none of them are like Cortland Sutton or Brandon Ayuk or Deebo Samuel or any of those number 2 wide receivers or number 1 wide receivers that people have been talking about that the Steelers should go trade for. And I know there's a lot of people out there that still look at this offense and say it has to have a bona fide number 2 to attract attention away from everything else and to get those numbers. But I want to remind you of the last Steelers team to win a playoff game. That's the 2016-2017 Pittsburgh Steelers. That was a team where, yes, they had the killer bees that year, and those killer bees were killer. Ben Roethlisberger was going strong, Le'Veon Bell, and it was Antonio Brown. But behind Antonio Brown that year, there was not a lot going on at wide receiver because Marcus Wheaton was out for the year for an injury. Martavis Bryant was suspended again. And then Sammy Coates, they were hoping would step up that year, broke his hands in the first or second game of the season, and he never recovered. So when that happened, you looked at the yards that year. Brown had over 1,200 yards, but the next closest in receiving yards was Le'Veon Bell, and he had less than 620. After Le'Veon Bell, there was Eli Rogers. Yes, Eli Rogers was the number 2 leading wide receiver on the team, and he had less than 600 yards. And here's the thing. Even with the running backs being more involved in the passing game, I can totally see Pat Freiermuth, Calvin Austin, even Roman Wilson all being better options than what Eli Rogers was at that time. And no disrespect to Eli Rogers. He was an undrafted guy. He fought hard. He earned what he got. And I thought he worked his butt off to get there. But Eli Rogers was only in that position that year because two of the 2 primary receivers were supposed to be with Antonio Brown to complete the receiving room were all gone that year. But again, that was an offense that worked. That was an offense that, if you go back and look, they were ranked 10th in scoring, 7th in yards, and that was much led by the passing game where they were 5th in yards and 4th in touchdown passes that year. But here's the thing. Again, you look at it, they didn't have a real bona fide number 2. Now, it did come back to bite them when Le'Veon Bell went down in the AFC Championship game, and the Patriots were like, we're just going to double team Antonio Brown. Good luck with everybody else. But I think this team has depth that team did not. And it was in that time that if you look back at that year in 2016, another reason why I don't think the wide receiver 2 position will be as important this time around. Back in 2016, the Steelers threw the ball 60% of the time compared to running the ball 40% of the time. This year's team won't be doing that. Most likely it'll be closer to what happened in 2020 and 2019 with Arthur Smith when he was the offensive coordinator for the Tennessee Titans with Derrick Henry, where in 2019 it was a 52-48 split favoring the run. And then in 2019 it was almost a dead-on 50-50 split. That's what's going to happen here. So there's not going to be nearly as much space for a wide receiver to emerge. But even without a wide receiver 2, remember the 2016 Steelers offense was a problem. And they didn't run the ball. They ran the ball well. Le'Veon Bell still got his, but they weren't just shoving it down people's throats. They weren't running it a whole bunch of times. They were right in the middle of the league. They had the 16th most rushing attempts on the year, the 14th most rushing yards on the year. So this is a team that's going to be predicated on the run. I think that part of that is they're going to make that a much more important point. They're going to be better at that, and I think there's going to be an emphasis there. So to your point, John, if the Steelers' run game works and the offensive line holds up, that alone can negate the need for a dynamic wide receiver 2 that they acquire in a trade. Because that can be a whole other part of the offense. Like, for example, we talked about, you've heard me say it a lot of times. In the last 10 games of the season, the Steelers rushed for the second most yards in the NFL. And if the Steelers could be even top 10 let alone top 5 in rushing yards this season with the way that their offensive line's been invested in, with the running back duo that they have. That alone would change the dynamics there entirely. Like even from that year in 2016 when they really didn't need a number 2 wide receiver to get through the most of the season. You look at how that team worked, give them an even better running game, and it would be even Eli Rogers' role would be even smaller. So that's where I think that this is a great point it was a great question by John, and it's a point why myself, Alan Saunders, other people don't think that this trade is just going to happen just because. It needs to still have the right value to it for the Steelers to actually be able to go along with it to get a dynamic wide receiver 2 from a trade. But again, throw in the other talent on offense, and I'd say this group of offensive players is deeper than the 2016 Steelers offense. Now, I want to, again, emphasize, I am not saying it was better than the Killer Bees when they were in their prime, because that was like one of the last years of them all being together and in their prime. But I'm not saying that Russell Wilson's better than Ben Roethlisberger, or that George Pickens is in the same stratosphere as Antonio Brown was at the time, or that Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren are Le'Veon Bell. But what I am saying is the players behind that big 3, like if you take Pickens, Harris, and Wilson off the table, just like you take Bell, Brown, and Ben off the table for that team, you would like take that group of this year's group of Pat Freiermuth, Darnell Washington, Calvin Austin, Roman Wilson, and even throw in Jaylen Warren in there. You throw that on that Steelers team, they're a better team because of it. So they're going to be deeper, and I think that's how they spread the ball around. It's a shared thing. It's not one guy's going to – it's not like George Pickens is going to get his 1,200 and another guy's going to get his 1,000. It's going to be George Pickens is going to get his 1,200, but, there also might be, like a bunch of guys hovering around 600, and that's totally fine as long as you're scoring touchdowns. So all that to say, I think that this is a great question by John, and just talking about how there are other ways to go about getting the production that people are talking about is needed from a wide receiver 2, and the Steelers have done it before at a pretty good clip. But like I said earlier, the offensive line does need to work for this to all happen. The offensive line is vital. We have a question about the offensive line, especially the younger players on it, on the next break, after this next break here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. But first, I want to remind you this show is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the #1 sportsbook in America. I love sports, and I love them so much that I never want them to stop. But as the playoffs for the NBA and the NHL wind down, we're getting fewer games. It's MLB and WNBA, and those are fun. I'm enjoying those. I had a great time watching the fever in the sky. But when your sports aren't sportsing as much, you still got to find ways to enjoy it. And a great way to enjoy it is to go on FanDuel Sportsbook, which is going to get you all the lines and edges in all the sports that are going on. All I have to do is open up the app right now and dream up bets anytime that I'm in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers, not just new customers, all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com/lockedon to start making the most of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. We're back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. We're going to continue taking your questions. I said it's a mailbag Monday, so let's get to the mailbag. We have a question from Jerry in Hastings, Pennsylvania. Jerry, take it away.
Hi, Chris. This is Jerry from Hastings, PA. Hey, I don't know what you think, but I believe there's way too much pressure or expectations being laid on 3 guys to turn this offensive line into some kind of dominating force in the NFL. Things could go bad. You're expecting 2 rookies and a first-year player to dominate defenses in the NFL, and I believe that's just way too much to lay on those 3 guys. I'll hang up and hopefully get to hear from you.
Thank you, Jerry, for your question. As always, you can call 412-223-6644 to get your question in on the Locked On Steelers hotline. Be sure to leave your name, where you're from, and keep your question under a minute. So, Jerry, to get to your question, I do think there's a legitimate question about leaning on youth because, as they're adapting to the NFL, there's questions that they're going to have to face that experienced veterans don't. But I also think it's a chance for these important players to get stronger, better, faster. I mean, look at Broderick Jones. I mean, there's a certain question as far as how much you're leaning on these guys and the pressure that's going to be mounted on them. But guess what? Broderick Jones had a lot of pressure on him last year. If he don't perform the way he did last year, Steelers don't make the playoffs. Joey Porter Jr., same thing. I think that the reason the Steelers are getting these guys, and I think part of what they're looking for dogs. And dogs just ain't about being physical. Dogs just ain't about going out there and just having skill. Dogs are about when it's my moment, when it's time to deliver, I'm going and getting it. And I think that's who the Steelers are trying to focus on and getting the high character guys, the guys that fit that dog mentality. And I think from everything we've seen, that's who Broderick Jones is. He's ready for the fight. Everything I've heard about Zach Frazier, that's who Zach Frazier is. Same thing with Troy Fautanu. So if anything, I think it's good that they're leaning on him. Now, and yes, the need for this offensive line to be dominant is a big ask in the NFL with all the talent that's on defensive lines. And they're going to be learning trial by fire. But the thing is, they'll also have two veterans in between all three of them in Isaac Seumalo and James Daniels. They'll help guide the way as they have. And they'll also have Russell Wilson managing the offense. So that's the other thing is that, they'll have veterans keeping them in the right state of mind. They'll have veterans, being there for them, helping them grow. I think that's a huge part of what the Steelers do need for this offensive line. And you want them to mature quickly. These are the tests that can help you learn more about them and learn how to push them. This is where Pat Meyer can say, all right, we're identifying your strengths and your weaknesses. Let's boost your strengths. Let's shore up your weaknesses, and let's make forward. But it's what the Steelers also had to do, if you remember, about 13 years ago, or maybe more like 11 years ago, when they had Marquise Pouncey, David DeCastro, Marcus Gilbert. It was all young offensive linemen in the early 2010s, and that group panned out very well. I wouldn't fret about the pressure that might be heaped upon these guys simply because I think that this is what you want. And if they're not up for the pressure of simply, being good, then they weren't right in the first place. So I think the rookies and Broderick Jones, because I understand you were talking about all the young guys, I think that they're fine. I think that it'll be interesting to see to see how they respond to tough moments and how they respond to adversity. But until that comes, I'm not going to presume that they can't handle pressure or anything like that, or that it's going to be too much. And I'm not saying that you are, but you're asking the question. And if I'm answering the question, I'm not worried about that. We'll see that if we see some worries about that, we'll address it then. But for me, I think this Steelers young offensive line, I think it's a good thing that they're a young offensive line because I think that they'll be able to adjust to a lot more. So with that question done, let's go to Ryan out in Ocean City, Maryland with a question on a quarterback.
Hi, this is Ryan from Ocean City, Maryland. I was just wondering, every time I see a interview from Justin Fields, he doesn't seem happy. I was wondering if that was just because he's in a position where he has to fight for his job, or if he's generally not happy, or if that's just honestly his personality. If you could just maybe break down, since you know him a little better, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. And as always, you can call, like Ryan did, 412-223-6644. Leave your name, where you're from, and keep your question under a minute. So Ryan, let's get to a few things. One, you're not the only person who's noticed that about Fields and his demeanor during interviews. He's not being super rambunctious, nor has he been over eager or cracking a lot of jokes. But I ask this: what does anyone expect of him right now? Because this is a guy, I just pulled up Chris Collinsworth. This is a guy who felt he was overlooked in the NFL draft in the first place. When he was taken the first round, 11th overall, he thought he should have been top 10. He thought that the teams that took quarterbacks ahead of him, he thought that they made big mistakes and he wanted to prove it. Then in Chicago, things just went poorly. They weren't ever, and they weren't always his fault. Some of it was his fault, but it didn't go well. And so now he's on the verge of being a backup for the rest of his career when he was thinking that he was going to be a franchise quarterback. So naturally, you're not just going to be peachy and super nice when he talks about it. That's because there's a lot of pressure there. So I think that what's happening with Justin Fields is that he's just on the verge of being a backup this year, and he's trying to stay focused. I don't hear unhappiness. I hear him being locked on and focused on what's ahead, on what he needs to do right now. Because if he messes up this opportunity, that might be it as far as, being an NFL starter. And I think that part of what he's doing is he's just trying to get through the interviews, which makes a lot of sense. We got more questions, though, coming up. I want to get to those questions here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, including one about training camp. Stick with us. We have a lot to discuss still. We'll be right back. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter. We continue taking your questions on the Locked On Steelers mailbag, talking with you all. Again, if you ever want to be on the show through the mailbag, call 412-223-6644. Leave your name, where you're from, and keep your question under a minute. We will try to get you on the show. This question comes from Frank out in Illinois. Frank, take it away.
Yeah, Chris, I'm Frank from Illinois. I just want to know if they had the training camp schedule for this year. Thank you very much. Also, what about the first day of in pads? I'd like to know when that is so I could make arrangements to come out that way. Okay, thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Frank. As always, it's great to hear people ask questions. And this one's less of an analysis question. It's just, hey, what is the training camp schedule? And I'll give y'all some tidbits. So this was released just a few weeks ago, actually. The Steelers also had a big change in training camp with how they're handling things. Normally, training camp practices where the bulk of the practices where we get to cover and people get to watch is right around 2 p.m. because Mike Tomlin often wants them to come out, and it's when it's hottest, and it's like, the hottest part of the day, and that was part of his training regimen. But this year it's been moved back. We haven't been given a great explanation for why that is, other than they just think it's a better option for what they're trying to do right now. But most days right now start either on 10:30 or 11:45 in the morning. So if you've been to training camp before, remember that it's going to be different this year. And I think that's a big part of that is something to actually really note if you want to go to training camp. And I think that, whatever the reason is there, it's going to be different. It's going to be handled different. And I suggest you check the schedule on the days that you plan to go there, whoever's listening to this or watching this, because it's going to be early in the morning, and it's going to be interesting to see how things, change moving forward. But as for which days to go, as far as pads and stuff, one of the biggest days that you can go to, or biggest night, I guess, is the night practice at Latrobe Memorial Stadium or Latrobe Memorial Field. It's away from St. Vincent College, where the bulk of training camp happens, but it's only like a 5-minute ride from there. And it's on Friday, August 2nd, 7 p.m. The pads are on, so they're hitting in those practices. They're doing things to put on a show. It's something they do for the community. It's a great experience. I suggest that you go if you haven't. And again, the pads are on. Now, as far as the first, days and pads, it's usually that second week. The first week, they'll get through things. They'll do the conditioning test on Thursday, and then they'll do stuff on Friday, and then they'll do stuff on Saturday. But then like that next Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, that's when the pads get on. So the second week. So you're looking at like July 30th and the 31st and August 1st. Those are going to be probably the days that you want to pay more attention to. If you're looking at the training camp schedule. So I do think that's certainly part of the thing here is kind of just learning what you got to learn about how training camp is going to work and adapting with what we're all adapting to. But it's a good question, training camp schedule. And we'll see how things work out as we get closer to there. But we got one last question. This one comes from Travis out in Memphis, Tennessee.
Yes, this is Travis Moten from Memphis, Tennessee. And I'm a Pittsburgh Steelers fan. And I would just like to ask, I would like to ask, will we basically get a chance to use fullbacks in this upcoming season? I think that could be our best way to possibly win a Super Bowl this year, that we make sure that we have a fullback that can block for those pure running backs that we do have. Seems like we might have 3 running backs to 4 good running backs. We need a real person that will play fullback, whether that's Connor Hayward, if he would accept this role, or just a real fullback. Thank you.
So Travis, first of all, thank you for calling in. Thank you everyone who called in for today's show. I don't think the Steelers really need to plan on using a fullback exclusively or anything like that, like in a specific way. I think they'll have the extra players that can be lead blockers at times. It's gonna be like there's a lot of different options there. I think the old position of fullback is just obsolete in today's NFL because of how they use it. And if you're talking about like, oh, what about lead blocking? Yeah, I think that could be that could certainly be helpful to have a fullback there. But I think here's the thing is that you can often find guys who do other roles to be that guy. And I think that's where Connor Hayward has been, because he's been, the third tight end, but also just the guy does everything. So Travis, I don't think the Steelers really plan to use a fullback in any specific way. I think that they'll have extra players kind of work as, lead blockers at times to kind of make up for that. And I just think, the old position of fullback is it's dying out. And, if that's what you're working on, keep working on it, but diversify your skills, because I think that if you're a football player out there trying to be a fullback for life, it's going to be a rough life. So I don't think, and I also don't think that the fullback will be that important. I think they're going to use multiple running backs in multiple formations and try to keep people guessing. So that's part of what I expect there. So it'll be interesting to see how things move forward with this when it comes to the Steelers offense and what gets prioritized and what Connor Hayward's role is for this upcoming season. But I could certainly see it working out. I could certainly see it working out so that the Steelers don't officially have a fullback, but a player, a person who is just like, I'm a de facto fullback for this one song that they're about to do. So all that being said, I don't think it's going to be exclusive. I think it's just going to be and people move on from that. That's our show here in the Locked On Steelers podcast. Thanks everyone for calling in. Thanks everyone for tuning in. We appreciate everyone who takes time to call us. We'll try to get, if you haven't been on the show, we'll try to get to you at some point this summer. We got a lot still to talk about here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Carter Critiques. Read my work at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Find me here on the Locked On Steelers podcast every day, Monday through Friday, breaking down your Pittsburgh Steelers right here on the Locked On Steelers podcast.